morning. Okay, so we are very happy to open this morning and the sessions that we have today. Very interesting session. I'm sure that we all look forward. I would like just to emphasize that each of the speakers has exactly 20 minutes, and then because it's very important that we have time for questions and for discussion. So please keep in mind just to speak 20 minutes, not more. And I hope that the chairpersons will do their job and counting them. Let me just first introduce our first chairman for this morning, Dr. Joseph Bollard. He is a friend, for many years, a friend of our center. He dedicated much time, efforts to fight against bigotry, against racism, against anti-Semitism in Switzerland and in Europe. He cooperated with many Jewish and non-Jewish NGOs and organizations who struggle against anti-Semitism. He is now the head of two organizations. This is the main mission. In some way, it's a one-man show for many years, and his main expertise is monitoring the way that hate groups and terror groups are being financed, and he's monitoring these ways. That this is, of course, you understand that this is a very important task to understand from where the money is coming. So, again, good morning to everyone, and please, Mr. Bollard.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very honored to be the chairman of the first session we have. And it is troubled encounters majority-minority relationship. We are looking at the others, at the minorities in the different countries. What Ronnie said, Dr. Stauber, about financing of terror, what I see until today is how or why we would get such a flow of money as the other side gets. And it's unbelievable amounts of money which is spent, which is given and spent. We have to fight for everything. But that's not the subject today. So I would like to ask again the speakers not to extend more than 20 minutes, because I believe that whatever has been said by the speakers, it should be matter and time given to discuss it and to ask questions. So to ask questions and get answers is almost as important as the whole session itself. I'm very pleased to introduce the first speaker. It is Professor Andreas Zick. He is Professor for Socialization and Conflict Research at the University of Bielefeld, Germany. He is member and designated director of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Research on Conflict and Violence. His academic profile is interdisciplinary. His PhD and habilitation is in psychology. He is a professor in educational science and member of the Faculty of Sociology. Since the late 1980s, he is constantly researching prejudice and racism in Europe. Today, he will report on the latest cross-European study. Professor Zick.
20 minutes to present you an idea of our projects in the last 10-15 years. Then I'm going to tell you something about our approach. It's an approach on group-focused enmity. I will explain that. I will go to dimensions, the extent of prejudices, especially anti-Semitism in Europe. I will show you some data, very interesting for Poland, and then I will shortly speak about some roots, some causes of these prejudices. I'm a social psychologist, so now the first paper is on the sentiments, the attitudes of the majority. Now, the idea of our project on group-focused enmity, and especially on anti-Semitism, is very easy. We think that Europe more and more has a consensus that the human and democratic quality of a society is determined by the quality of experiences and intercourses with the social groups. That's a democratic statement. And if you all agree on that sentence, every society has to ask itself a very critical question. And the question is, to what extent are individuals and groups in our society with different descent, different gender, sexual or religious orientations, with or without disabilities, work, etc., recognized as equal in, worth. We call it gleichwertig in German, Gleichwertigkeit. Or else are confronted with devaluation, discrimination and exclusion. This is the core question every society has to ask itself now, if you have consensus on the first sentence. Now what we observe in Europe is very different patterns of prejudices. There's anti-Semitism, and I will focus on that. But all over Europe we see sexism, homophobia, rights of these prejudices against newcomers, xenophobia, we have racism, etc., etc. So what we see is a syndromatic devaluation of groups within societies. And that's what we wanted to explore in the last years. This is what we call the syndrome of group focus enmity. Now, I will very shortly tell you something about our empirical approach. I will tell you an empirical project. That's why I have to speak about data. What we have done in the last 10 years in Germany is we run a survey, representative survey in Germany, 10 years. Every single year we run a survey. We published it and showed it to the society. We additionally have a panel survey. So for 10 years we interviewed identical persons, 10 years. And at the end of 2008 we run a cross-European survey in 8 European countries. In a minute you will see the countries where we have been. We have different foundations who granted this project. It's quite a huge project, so there are different foundations granting that. And I'm very happy about this.
Professor, could you say who is we?
It's a group of researchers working with the data. Last week there were 52 researchers working with the data. We is the Institute of Interdisciplinary Research on Conflict and Violence in Germany, University of Bielefeld. And mainly the main responsible persons was Wilhelm Heidmeier and me. We were the responsible persons, but we have graduates, etc., etc. So we is a very huge group.
University institution. It's of the university, the institution?
Yeah. It's an institute of the university. Yeah? Okay? And if you like to work with the data, you can have the data. Yeah? So there are many more people now working with the data, showing that we were not right. Anyway. What we did is we run standardized interviews, computer telephone interviews. We know the restrictions of such surveys. They have restrictions. But we have a very good conference here. You will see data from hate speech, etc. Interviews. Respondents over 16 years. We pre-tested every measure, so we run qualitative study on the measure. Each concept you will see, like anti-Semitism, was measured at least with 2, 3, 4, 6 items. People normally, we presented them a sentence which was tested to be prejudiced, and then we asked, do you strongly agree, somewhat agree, or disagree, or strongly disagree. So the scale of anti-Semitism, for example, runs from 1 to 4. Maximum is 4. And we have tested in the cross-European study, we run a cross-cultural equivalence test. If you run a study in Poland on anti-Semitism, maybe the prejudices against Jews are not the same as in Germany. So you have to test for equivalence. Normally surveys don't do, so it's hard to believe what they are really doing. So the idea was anti-Semitism, for example, is linked to other prejudices as well. When you are prone to be anti-Semitic, there's a high probability that you are also Islamophobic, homophobic, against disabled people. This was the idea. We needed an empirical test for that. And the question is, if you have all these different patterns, what is linking all these different prejudices? What's behind anti-Semitism and all other prejudices? And we run very critical tests. I don't show you the details because then you get annoyed about all these different data. What we saw in our data is that an ideology of unequal worth, when you believe that there's a hierarchy in society between groups, some groups are on the top and some groups are on the bottom, and this is okay, because societies as such an ideology of unequal worth makes you prone to develop a syndrome of group-focused enmity. What we also showed is that these different patterns are interrelated. This is a result of a complicated statistical analysis, a structural equation model. In every year we could show that there is a syndromatic devaluation of groups. So it makes no sense only singly to speak about anti-Semitism. You have to take into mind that people who are prone to be anti-Semitic show a lot of other different prejudices. This is the same in every year in Germany, this is the same across Europe. Yeah? And we published it. Additionally, a cause, for example, I feel deprived compared to immigrants, can trigger this ideology of unequal worth, can cause anti-Semitism, even if your deprivation goes against the immigrants. Yeah? And what's also interesting, we could show that anti-Semitism, for example, can cause a discrimination not only of Jews, but of other groups as well. This is the generalization and the generalizing nature of group-focused enmity. So it's a syndromatic devaluation of groups. And we tested it empirically, and we can really support this. Now, dimensions of all these different patterns. Anti-immigrant attitudes. Anti-immigrant attitudes, and now you see across Europe, from France to Hungary, you see anti-immigrant prejudices, they run from 1 to 4. You see there is a bit an east-west difference. Hungary is on the top, anti-immigrant attitudes, but also Great Britain. Yeah? There is an east-west difference, east higher than the west, but you see countries like Great Britain are high in anti-immigrant attitudes. If you look to a single item, there are too many immigrants in Germany, in France, the Netherlands, etc. You see representative surveys, a high rate of people say there are too many immigrants, although here you see the percentages of the immigrants in the country. For example, in England, representative survey, 62% said there are too many immigrants. They have a rate of 12% immigrants. Yeah? So, but here you see Poland, nice data. Poland, a very low level of anti-immigrant, very low rate, and only 27% agreed to that item. Poland, very positive value in anti-immigrant attitudes. Anti-Muslim attitudes, and now you see the scale is increasing. So what's behind, if it runs from 1 to 4, you see that more than 50% agree on single statements. This is a scale behind that are single statements, high value, and now you see less differences between the European countries, less differences. So a bit Europe is united in anti-Muslim attitudes. Just an example, here you see Islam is a religion of intolerance. And you have to take into mind, if people agree to that, the probability of anti-Semitism also increases. And you see, the majority of European peoples we have in our sample agreed that Islam is a religion of intolerance. You see, only Netherlands is quite low, but still 46%. Still 46%. Here you see the rates of Muslims nearly. It's very hard to find objective data how many Muslims are there. Yeah? So, and now we come to anti-Semitism. We know, and yesterday we already heard it, there are very different patterns of anti-Semitism. There is no single anti-Semitism anymore. Traditional anti-Semitism rests upon the stereotype of anti-Jewish conspiracy, old-fashioned anti-Jewish stereotypes, yeah, money, etc. You find it when you walk around here. Responsibility for the death of Jesus Christ, scapegoating for the persecution. These are expressions of traditional anti-Semitism. Let's see anti-Semitism across Europe. There's a clear difference. The East is higher than the West. Highest values in Poland and Hungary, see it here, and quite low traditional anti-Semitism in Western European countries, but still France and Italy a bit higher. But Poland and Hungary, very high values. And now I show you Hungary and Poland. Jews have too much influence, and you know the rate of Jewish people living in these Western Eastern European countries. Hungary, 69%. Yeah? The absolute rate of Jewish people is 0.5. But Poland, very high. Yeah? Netherlands, very low in traditional anti-Semitism. Now let's go to modern facets of anti-Semitism. We know that in a couple of countries more and more this traditional open anti-Semitism is outlawed, so it became more subtle, more modern. Like, for example, and that's what we observe in Europe, secondary anti-Semitism. It's a concept from the Zentrum für Antisemitismusforschung, Werner Bergmann and Rainer Erb. They say that secondary anti-Semitism is a relativization, extenuation and neglect of the Nazi crimes. It's a demand of a final cut, Schlussstrich, in the history, the reversal of guilt and shame to the Holocaust. Yeah? Let's see secondary anti-Semitism across Europe. Still, there is an East-West difference. So even in secondary anti-Semitism, Poland and Hungary are quite high. That's why I ask myself, isn't secondary anti-Semitism more and more the traditional form of anti-Semitism? And you see Germany. High values in secondary anti-Semitism. What you see here in Sweden is great. I only had a small sample. Sweden was too expensive to run a survey. Poland was the cheapest. Yeah, but Sweden was too expensive. But you see Poland, Hungary, and now Poland is on the top in secondary anti-Semitism. Yeah? Let's see one item. Jews try to take advantage of having been victims during the Nazi era. Poland, 72% in a representative household survey. Yeah? This is not the sentiment of extremist group. 68% in Hungary, but you see in Germany, and that's what we saw 10 years in Germany, about 50% agree to such an item. Netherlands, quite low. Yeah?
PT is Portugal, yes?
PT is Portugal. Oh. PT is Portugal. Now, third dimension of anti-Semitism, Israel-related anti-Semitism. And yesterday the conference was started by this topic as well. So we say we have anti-Israel related anti-Semitism if people met one of the following criteria. We said we speak about anti-Israel related anti-Semitism if people neglect Israel's rights to exist and to defend. Or if they use a double standard, Israel and no other country, no other nation is blamed for what they are doing. Third, taking all Jews responsible for Israel's policy, or if people criticize Israel's policy using anti-Semitic stereotypes and associations, and almost associations by reference to symbols for Nazis. If people meet one of these criteria, we speak about anti-Israel related anti-Semitism. We know that there's a huge debate on that topic. Anti-Israel related anti-Semitism, you still see an East-West difference. Poland is on top. Anti-Israel related anti-Semitism. So Poland is quite high, but you see these data here in Germany and Great Britain as well, high levels of anti-Israel related anti-Semitism. The problem is in France, there is a law against surveying such sentiments. So the French will solve the problem by simply restricting surveys on that.
Who was asking to put in Portugal? Because they are high in every criteria, but they don't have Jews, they don't have anything. In Portugal.
Here in Portugal, here, they have nothing. But the people agree. Representative surveys. For the sampling.
Yeah, the sampling, because they are not Jews there.
I know. We had about 1,000, 1,500 in every country. Representative for households. So it is not a strange sample. And it's not. I know. But people use media during conference. Maybe we have some presentation, and this is something we already know since 30 years. In anti-Semitism, since 1,000 years, you can be anti-Semitic without any Jews. And this happens in Portugal. Okay. So, for example, one sentence showing anti-Israel related anti-Semitism in our study was: Israel is conducting a war of extermination, Vernichtungskrieg. This is simply Nazi association against the Palestinians. And you see now Portugal, even Portugal, 49% agree on such an item, in Poland 63%. So Poland is on the top, that's what you already saw on the scale, but here's a single item, Germany 47%. Yeah? And something is going on in the Netherlands and countries like Italy, because it's a bit limiting, but we have over 30%. Yeah? War of extermination. So, yeah? Now some roots, only some causes. It's 10 years research, I can speak a long time, but what are the most interesting causes, roots of unfocused anti-Semitism? If we speak about why people are anti-Semitic, yeah, I remind you of Albert Einstein, who said it's easier to destroy an atom than a prejudice, which means that prejudice had several causes. It goes back to democratic dispositions, it goes back to collective ideologies within a society, and it goes back to the culture. So there are different levels, causes of anti-Semitism. What do we see in our study? We see in our study high educated people compared to low educated people, less anti-Semitism. Clear pattern. Control it for age, for gender, clear education effect. But the effect is less different when it comes to secondary or anti-Israel related anti-Semitism. Then this education effect is going down. It's limited. Yeah? Clear age effect in every country. People over 65. The higher you are in age, clear linear trend, the older you are, the more anti-Semitic in our study, in every country. But again, the difference here, this is Germany, is less clear if it comes to the new facets of anti-Semitism. Clear effect of religiousness. People who say in Europe, I am very religious, and we control it for education, age, gender, etc., clearly higher in anti-Semitism. There is Christian anti-Semitism across Europe in every European country. Yeah? Pattern. Very clear. Now, political ideologies. This is only social demographics. Are there any ideologies which are linked to anti-Semitism? And we tested a lot of different attitudes on the society, on my experiences within society. We tested the effect of authoritarianism, threats by immigrants, anti-diversity beliefs, social dominance orientation, which is a power orientation, political alienation, political orientation, etc. And what we showed in our data across Europe, those dark grey factors predict anti-Semitism and group-focused enmity much better and make it very easy. The best indicators of group beliefs, the best causes explaining anti-Semitism is still authoritarianism. If you believe, strict laws against deviant people, conformity, threats by immigrants and threats by the economic crisis, highly predicting anti-Semitism, anti-diversity beliefs. That's maybe why in the Netherlands it's lower levels of anti-Semitism. So cultural, multicultural ideologies, even if we don't like them, but they are predicting, if you disagree with them, predicting anti-Semitism, and a strong indicator is dominance orientation. Who's on the top of the society and who's below, so the hierarchy in society. 2 minutes, I will make it. 2 messages, and then I'm finished with my slideshow. You can have the slides. We have a lot of people across Europe who are more and more mistrusting democracy. In Germany, I can show you that mistrust in democratic principles is increasing significantly. For example, in Germany, 69% agreed democracy leads to more rotten compromises than to sound decisions. This is clearly a mistrust against democracy. And you see the percentages, this is Germany, yeah, here. So high levels of, it's a bit shelter of politicians, etc., etc. But what we see in our data, these black bar are those people who have a high value of mistrust in democracy compared to people who trust in democracy. You see nearly in every facet of group-focused enmity, yeah? If people mistrust democracy, they are in the group of those who mistrust democracy, higher levels of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Muslim attitudes, anti-Semitism. Secondly, what we observe in Germany is more and more people believe, and it's about 25% now, representative, that economic principles rule the world. Yeah? So, you have to show effort, social life is organized by an economic principle. That's what we call an economistic ideology. We cannot afford human failures anymore. 20% in Germany. We show too much consideration for lame ducks, 30% in our society. It's an economistic view of the society. People believe in it. What we can clearly show in our data is that people who have a strong economistic value show very high values of group-focused enmity. For example, those who believe in economistic values, the majority, 53%, is anti-Semitic. So you adopt the economic principle to your life and then you get anti-Semitic. Okay, culture and context. 1 minute? Is it okay? 30 seconds. This is a message for those who are wealthy. What we can show in our German data is, these are 4 rows. Poor people, lower income, middle income, high income. 10 years, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism linked to anti-immigrant attitudes. That's what we call right-wing populism. And you see in our data, and it showed in anti-Semitism, the last 3 years, the group of wealthy people increased in their anti-Semitism. It's not the poor people, it's not the middle class, it's the wealthy people who have an increase in nearly all facets of group-focused enmity.
In Europe.
In Germany. In Europe, we don't have 10 years. So we cannot show a trend. I only have 1 monitor. Europe has a problem in monitoring.
That's in Germany.
That's in Germany. That's only in Germany. Okay, now I finish. You know this study of Vogtländer and Vogt, maybe? Because it was in the Arbeit. They simply showed that there's a correlation between pogroms against Jews in the Middle Ages, the votes for the NSDAP, yeah, in 1928, and now they show that in these areas where there were pogroms in the Middle Ages, the level of anti-Semitism is higher than in every other region, which means there's a strong culture of anti-Semitism. And now I finish with a question, and not with an answer, because you said questions are good. My question is how to establish e-commerce. After showing you all that, I think protect those who are discriminated and support and establish tolerance, which is based on worth and recognition and not simply standing others.
Good morning. I'm going to do my best to stick to about 22 minutes. I'm going to read quickly. I want to thank Dina Pratt and the Cantor Center for inviting me to give this paper today, the title of which is The Holocaust, Ethnic Identity Politics, and the New Canadian Museum for Human Rights, or CMHR, as it's called. Unlike France, Germany, and the United States, Canada does not have a national memorial dedicated to the Holocaust. The Canadian government announced this year that a national monument to the Holocaust would be built somewhere in the capital region of Ontario, funded by private money in a limited government matching program. The attempt to create some kind of national Holocaust memorial in Canada is actually decades long and has been beset by a variety of challenges that have evolved with the changing social and political contexts of the time. This presentation will provide a brief history of this protracted process. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights, or CMHR, is the first national museum in the world to be focused on this progressive subject. After years of delays, the museum is scheduled to open in 2014 in Winnipeg, a city of 750,000 people that lies at the physical center of the country. Canada has not created a new federal museum since 1967, and this institution will be the first one to be built outside the capital region of Ontario. The museum was originally the brainchild of Israel, or Izzy Asper, CEO of CanWest Global Communications, which was, until its bankruptcy in 2009, the largest media company in Canada with radio, television, and publishing assets worldwide. In 1983, Israel Asper created a philanthropic foundation named for his family, and it has funded a variety of charitable initiatives in health, culture, and education. In 1997, the Asper Foundation established the Holocaust and Human Rights Program for Canadian high school students. The program offers grade 9 students a curriculum on the Holocaust and the history of human rights, including conversations with Holocaust survivors. Students are required to spend 18 hours in a volunteer position in the community and to sign a personal commitment to advance the cause of human rights after a school visit to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. This program was the inspiration for Izzy Asper's desire to build a Canadian version of the Washington Museum in Winnipeg. Instead of sending Canadian children to Washington every year, they would come to Winnipeg to see exhibits on the Holocaust and on their own national history, both its human rights failures and successes. Of particular interest to Asper was the pedagogical focus on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Canada's Bill of Civil and Political Rights entrenched in the Constitution in 1982. To understand the complexity of the CMHR and the debates surrounding its creation, one must go back in time and examine the Canadian War Museum controversy that erupted in 1997. The Canadian War Museum was the first national museum built in Canada, and it was also an institution that suffered years of neglect. A 1991 report written by the Task Force on Military History Museum Collections in Canada called the War Museum an embarrassment and a national disgrace, criticizing its outmoded design, technology, and research functions. Canada's National Museum of Human History, the Canadian Museum of Civilization, was in charge of overseeing the War Museum, and in response to this report, it provided $1.7 million in new exhibit funding and allowed the hiring of an architect to design an expansion of the museum. In 1995, the Friends of the Canadian War Museum began a fundraising campaign called Passing the Torch that targeted, quote, wealthy Jewish and Dutch veterans with the eventual goal of raising $2 million from each group, end quote. Dutch and Jewish veterans would each get a gallery in the refurbished War Museum. Over the next 2 years, the gallery to honor Jewish veterans of the Canadian military transmogrified into a Holocaust gallery, which initially was 2,000 square feet in size, but grew to 6,000 square feet, making it the largest space in the entire museum. It appears that the motivation for including a Holocaust gallery was financial, both in terms of fundraising for the War Museum and in order to attract increased revenue from visitors. During the 1990s, the answers to the museum's questionnaires had illustrated a growing public interest in the Holocaust, and the 1992 Anne Frank exhibit was one of the museum's most successful. Clearly, building a Holocaust gallery was perceived by the War Museum staff to be a way to save the museum and guarantee its financial future. The $12 million renovation, including the 6,000 square foot gallery dedicated to the history of the Holocaust, was announced in November 1997. Public reaction was swift. Canadian veterans withdrew their support for the project immediately, stating, quote, "The Holocaust has no connection with Canada's military history," end quote. Canada's most prominent veteran, Cliff Chatterton, was unequivocal, quote, "The Holocaust Gallery has more to do with political correctness than military history. It's not part of their mandate," end quote. Chatterton also promised to withdraw the donation of $150,000 from veterans groups if the Holocaust Gallery proceeded. Most tellingly, however, Chatterton said, quote, "A gallery depicting Holocaust horrors will detract from the story of Canada's military history and will become the pièce de résistance of the War Museum," end quote. The Canadian Jewish Congress in B'nai B'rith responded by saying that a Canadian Holocaust memorial is welcome, but they prefer that it stand alone. Incredibly, the Canadian Senate struck a subcommittee on Veterans Affairs on the specific question of the Holocaust Gallery, and over 50 witnesses testified over a 2-week period. As a result of the vociferous outcry against the Holocaust Gallery, on February 19, 1998, the Museum of Civilization decided, quote, "The Canadian War Museum will not include a controversial Holocaust Gallery. The Holocaust story can best be told in a separate venue fully dedicated to it. The museum will look for an alternative site for a standalone Holocaust Gallery, the preferred choice of both veterans and Jewish groups," end quote. That is where the matter stood until April 3, 2002, when an article entitled $125 million Holocaust Museum for City appeared in the Winnipeg Free Press. The article explained that Izzy Asper was spearheading a drive for a Holocaust memorial, quote, "on par with the Holocaust Museum in Washington to be built in Winnipeg. This would, quote, honor a long-standing dream of Canada's Jewish community for a national remembrance to the Holocaust," end quote. The museum would, quote, "in addition to marking the Holocaust, have a strong human rights focus touching on all forms of racism and discrimination," end quote. As the former leader of the Provincial Liberal Party in Manitoba, Asper was a supporter of the federal government and a friend of Liberal Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. The two had been in discussion about the museum plan for over 7 months, since September 2001. In a July 2002 article, the project was described for the first time as a, quote, "world-class human rights museum," end quote. And referring to the War Museum controversy, the article stated that there is no national remembrance to the Holocaust, and the government is eager to honor a commitment for a standalone memorial made 3 years ago. Several months later, in February 2003, a group composed of 27 ethnic communities going by the name Canadians for a Genocide Museum began to argue in the press, quote, "The federal government should not put tax dollars into a museum that marks the suffering of one race at the expense of others. We believe that all genocides should be memorialized. We shouldn't single out one as being more significant or more important than others. All are dreadful and all should be remembered," end quote. This group was established years before and began lobbying the government in May 1999, after the War Museum controversy, to build a national museum commemorating genocide in the 20th century. Led by John Gregorovich, chairman of the Ukrainian Civil Liberties Association, or the UCCLA, Canadians for a Genocide Museum had the support of members of the Ukrainian, Asian, Armenian, Turkish, and Palestinian communities, among others. The director of the Asper Foundation, Mo Levy, responded to these public criticisms by saying the museum would not play favorites and would listen to all concerns. Quote, "It is a museum for human rights, not the Holocaust," end quote. In April 2003, Israel Asper formally announced that the Canadian Museum for Human Rights would be located in Winnipeg, and that it had the support of the federal and municipal governments, who committed $30 million and the land, respectively. 6 months later, unexpectedly, in October 2003, Israel Asper died from a heart attack, and the museum became the focus of his daughter Gail, then president of the Asper Foundation, who continues to raise funds for the museum and remains committed to trying to realize the vision of her father. For the next 5 years, fundraising continued under the direction of the Friends for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, while the exact nature of the museum was negotiated privately. A major concern for the Asper Foundation was the annual operating costs of the museum, estimated to be $22 million a year. The Canadian government does not cover the operating costs of institutions it does not own. After years of negotiation, in April 2007, the new Conservative government, led by Stephen Harper, announced that the CMHR would be a national institution operated as a Crown corporation and would be located in Winnipeg. The federal government committed $100 million to the construction of the CMHR and finally agreed to cover its operating costs. On March 13, 2008, the bill creating the Canadian Museum for Human Rights received royal assent in Parliament. and construction began in April 2009. For 10 months, beginning in May, a Content Advisory Committee traveled through 20 cities across Canada to speak to Canadians about the content of the new National Museum. This fall, the exterior shell of the museum was completed, and we are told that the museum is scheduled to open on time. However, the question of content still remains a mystery and promises to be an ongoing battle between a number of local groups. Predictably, the Holocaust remains at the very center of this debate. Back in 2006, James Kafia, past president of the Canadian Arab Federation and a representative of the group Canadians for a Genocide Museum, asked Canadians to protest the CMHR and to request that the Governor-General withdraw her support for the museum, stating, quote, "We are calling upon Her Excellency, the Right Honourable Michelle Jean, to withdraw her support for this initiative because we are not convinced that the Asper Museum will be inclusive or equitable in its treatment of the many episodes of genocide and crimes of humanity that befouled not only 20th century Europe, but other regions as well. Of course, we have no objection to an exhibit on the Holocaust, which took millions of Jewish and non-Jewish lives, but that crime is well known and already extensively treated in museums around the world. We believe a Canadian institution funded largely by the taxpayer should not suggest that any atrocity is more deserving of attention than others, or that the suffering that befell one community should be made to appear as more worthy of memory than those endured by others. We want a museum that is not partial or prejudiced and that is developed and managed openly instead of behind closed doors. The Asper Foundation's proposal does not meet these criteria. Accordingly, we are asking our friends and supporters to contact the Governor-General and petition her to withdraw her support, at least until there are public assurances that our frankly stated concerns have been addressed. Her Majesty's representative in Canada should not be engaged in partisanship, nor in endorsing a project that is so very controversial, end quote. During the national tour of the museum's Content Advisory Committee in June 2009, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, which represents 1.2 million people in Canada, submitted their demands, calling for a focus on Canadian stories and for the inclusion of the internment of 4,000 Ukrainian Canadians by the government during World War I as so-called enemy aliens. They also called for a genocide gallery and for it to include the Holodomor, or the Ukrainian famine of 32 to 33. In this 3-page document, there are 7 statements that refer to special interests, lobby groups, and concerns or interests of one ethnic group, all with the clear demand that no particular ethnic, religious, or racial minority's historical experience should dominate the exhibit space within this national and publicly funded museum. There is no specific mention of Jews in this document for obvious reasons, but it is clear that they are the group whose, quote, interests and experience are perceived as too dominant by the UCC. The final report of the CMHR's Content Advisory Committee was released in September 2010. On December 9th, the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress released a statement entitled Canadian Museum for Human Rights, a Call for Inclusiveness, Equity, and Fairness. This document condemned the museum's report for 3 reasons. It made only passing reference to Canada's first national internment operations. The Holodomor will not have a permanent and prominent position in the museum, as does the Holocaust, and the crimes of communism received no mention in the report. The UCC document argues that, quote, the composition of the board and advisory bodies of the CMHR have been dominated by friends and supporters of the Asper Foundation. This unfortunately brings into question the objectivity of the Content Advisory Report, the museum layout and content, and the selection process for staff and consultants to the CMHR. The current vision of the CMHR, as expressed by the Content Advisory Committee, is to include only 2 permanent galleries in the museum, one devoted to Aboriginal issues and another to the Holocaust. Any other experiences and issues will be addressed thematically in the remaining galleries. This is unacceptable because this vision of the CMHR is not reflective of the experience of all Canadians, and certainly not of those of one of Canada's founding peoples and largest ethnic constituencies, the Ukrainian-Canadian community, end quote. The UCC then called for a new board of trustees and a second Content Advisory Council to be established by the museum. Shortly thereafter, the president of the German-Canadian Congress, representing 3.2 million people in Canada, weighed in to support the Ukrainian community, stating, quote, we shouldn't have a Holocaust exhibit as a permanent exhibit if no one else has one. I thought it would be an equal opportunity for everybody. The way it is, it's one type of exhibit for the Holocaust, and one for the native people, and separate types of exhibits for the rest of the world. That's not the proper way, end quote. Tony Bergmeyer went on to stress that German Canadians, quote, certainly are not Holocaust deniers. We know they suffered, end quote. but said his organization would be contacting the federal government with its concerns. In March 2011, I was called by an editor of the Winnipeg Free Press and asked to write an editorial about the ongoing public assault on the Holocaust Gallery and the CMHR, including a recent postcard campaign designed and executed by the Ukrainian Civil Liberties Association. The editorial, entitled "The War Against the Holocaust," characterized the attempts to remove the Holocaust Gallery from the CMHR as politically motivated and exposed the UCCLA pig postcard campaign as offensive and divisive. I handed out 2 photocopies of both the front and the back of that postcard, so maybe share amongst yourselves because there were only 20 copies made. The front cover of the postcard depicts a fat pig with a bullwhip overseeing an emaciated horse dragging a wagon. The image is taken from the 1947 Ukrainian edition of George Orwell's novel Animal Farm. In the story, the pigs are the Stalinist communist ruling class who enslave and dominate all the other animals, but claim critically all animals are equal. The back of the UCCLA postcard has a pig whispering into the ear of a sheep in a conspiratorial manner, quote, "All galleries are equal, but some galleries are more equal than others," end quote. Clearly, the pigs are supporters of the Holocaust Gallery, which is characterized as a vehicle of domination, inequality, and exploitation. The imagery of the Jew as pig has a very long and well-established history in European anti-Semitism, and of course, it is also a theme today in Islamic anti-Semitism, where Jews are purported to be the descendants of apes and pigs, end quote. Due to the constraints of space, I could not explain the obvious reference to the infamous Judo-Communist stereotype evoked by the postcard. Ironically, though, that same day the Free Press published a letter to the editor by Lubomir Lusiak, the UCCLA's director of research, who I'm sure designed this postcard, who employed Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands to observe, quote, "the overrepresentation of Jews in the Communist Party, and particularly in its secret police and Gulag concentration camp system administration," end quote. Letters in response to the editorial sent to the Free Press and to the Canadian Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism were unanimously positive in the sense that people were shocked that this kind of anti-Semitic propaganda was used to protest against the CMHR Holocaust Gallery, and were also grateful for the expose. So where does Canada's elusive and embattled Holocaust memorial stand at the moment? The CMHR has reassured the Jewish community that, quote, "the Holocaust will be represented in a permanent exhibit within the CMHR," end quote. However, what the Holocaust Gallery will actually contain as content and how it is placed and presented in the context of a federally owned and operated Canadian Human Rights Museum remains a mystery. The challenges we face today in teaching and publicly memorializing the Shoah in Canada appear to be multiplying rather than receding, and this reality, I would like to suggest, makes the likelihood of continued public recognition of the Holocaust as a singular event in Western history unstable and uncertain. Sparked by the creation of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, the renewed public debate over Holocaust memorialization in Canada suggests that there is not just fatigue at work in parts of contemporary society, but a growing sense of resentment against the Holocaust that may stymie its ongoing public memorialization. For years, this resentment has been directed against the family who founded the CMHR and against the wider Jewish community. Some critics have gone so far as to cast the family and the community in classic anti-Semitic terms, while at the same time carefully omitting the semantic signifier Jew. Critics sometimes describe the museum as a kind of money, elite conspiracy, designed to elevate Jewish suffering above that of other ethnic groups. This is achieved via the Holocaust, which is perceived to be a vehicle for some kind of Jewish propaganda by which Jews maintain their supposed domination over society. Some critics would have us believe that the Canadian government is executing this conspiracy on behalf of the Jewish community at the taxpayers' expense. Sadly, and most ironically then, Canadian debates about the design and content of a human rights museum, which was originally conceived of as the fruition of a government promise to build a national Holocaust memorial, end up replicating the oldest and most pernicious canards of the Western anti-Semitic canon. As for a national monument to the Holocaust, the Canadian government approved a bill at the beginning of December 2010 to build a national Holocaust memorial in Ottawa within 3 years. Not surprisingly, controversy ensued over who will pay for it. The Conservative government has agreed to donate the land, but the monument must be paid for with private funds, despite the fact that none of the other 16 national monuments in Canada have been privately funded. After dealing with the Canadian public for the last 5 years with the CMHR and the so-called controversy of its 4,500 square foot Holocaust gallery, the Conservatives know precisely how much support there would be in Canada for a taxpayer-funded memorial to the Holocaust. That is why the Jewish community will end up funding Canada's Holocaust monument. Strangely, it seems that the only way a multicultural country like Canada can hope to teach or memorialize the Shoah in this day and age is through a process of adaptation and distortion. For example, the National Holocaust Monument is already being de-Judaized and customized for public consumption on its government website, and it has yet to even be designed. Quote, "The Holocaust stands alone in the annals of human history. It was not just a crime perpetrated against a specific group of people. It was a crime that challenged the fundamental values all civilized people hold dear: freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law." Jews are not mentioned on any page in that website. The word does not appear. Today, there are two dominant ways that people try to appease the growing resentment against the Holocaust. The first is to downplay the Jewishness of the Holocaust experience and to universalize it to include all the groups persecuted under the Third Reich. This new revisionism is very popular, especially in Canada, because it is perceived to be inclusive and therefore fair. No one is left out of the horror story. However, this revisionist approach nonetheless violates historical reality. The Nazi regime was not an equal opportunity exterminator of peoples. For 12 long years, it focused obsessively on one group in particular and designed a final solution to that so-called Judenfrage. A second tactic used to make the Holocaust tolerable for public consumption is to employ it as some kind of vehicle for basic civil, civic, or ethical education. Auschwitz, of all things, is used to instruct North American children not to call each other names or bully one another. These two increasingly popular pedagogical approaches, Holocaust inclusionism and Holocaust-based behavior modification, will no doubt determine the final content and design of the Holocaust Gallery and the new CMHR. One can see that the reality of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is in fact very far removed from the anti-Semitic delusions of its critics. In fact, whether visitors to the museum will actually learn anything of significance about the final solution to the Jewish question, or the very specific anti-Semitic hatred that generated it in the first place, or about the diverse 1,000-year-old Jewish European civilization it obliterated, is unclear at this time. Thank you.
Conference, or you put yourself in any airplanes throughout the world.
I'm not sure if everybody here is aware that there's a city in Indonesia called Kudus. It's quite a large Muslim city, and there are mosques which replace Hindu temples that are in those designs. It's called Kudus because it's from Al-Quds, the furthest mosque. So those of you who are wondering where the furthest mosque is in the Quranic explanation, it's in Indonesia. Not far from that, though, there's a city called Semarang. Semarang is a very interesting place. I had an experience back this year in March. I was walking in a conference wearing my kippah, and there was a young Muslim man dressed in white robes who was following me for about 1.5 meters for 20 minutes or so. He clearly wanted to ask me a question. So, as I do in these situations, but normally I take less than 20 minutes, I walked up to him and asked him what he wanted to know. And he said, "Dear sir, I hope it's all right to ask you a question." I thought, he wants to know how many Christians were killed for a matzah or whatever it might be. No, he said, "Are you a cardinal?" He saw my kippah, "Am I a cardinal?" Now, he was involved in a group which sold anti-Semitic literature, but their knowledge of Jews firsthand was so vague, or he didn't even realise, a Jewish name like Jones, he would have thought was a giveaway. But I was wearing a kippah in Indonesia, it might be a clue. He didn't know. But on Sunday I was in Kalisz, a town in Poland, about 3 hours drive, or 5.5 hours drive if you use New Map on your Google, on your iPhone. And I was in that town, and I asked the Jewish guy who was showing me around, what would the reaction be like if I removed my cap and was walking around with my kippah? I was told it would just be a curiosity. You wouldn't incite much reaction. Oh, except if you come during the regular meetings of the Radio Maria group, in which case I would not advise you to take off your cap. And I said, when are these gas raids? They said, oh, they could happen any time. So I decided to wear my cap as I was walking around Cullish. Now, you might wonder what I was doing in Cullish, and it wasn't because I used my iPhone and was trying to get from Sydney to Melbourne. I was in Cullish because it's not far from a place called Blashki. Blashki is it's a small town. At one stage it was 50% Jewish, 50% non-Jewish. Now there are no Jews at all in the area. But the graves were reinterred. Before the Second World War, the graves were reinterred in Cullish, many of them. And if you walk in the streets of Cullish, you can see the gravestones from the old cemetery in Blashki if you look down as you're walking on the paving stones. Some are upturned and you see the Hebrew metro. One person left Cullish and eventually came to Australia, my great-great-grandfather. He arrived in Australia in 1858. And it's interesting, Zebostowski, who's a Polish Australian and a great student of migration, says there was one period where Australian government did not control who came in, between 1851 and 1860. So that's how my ancestor managed to come to Australia. It was the one time they took, as we say, took their eye off the ball. It was the time of the gold rush. And I was wondering, it's quite emotional for me because I'm as Australian as I come, at least in not only the Jewish world but beyond. My family's been in Australia over 150 years, well over 150 years. And while my wife's grandfather was on Schindler's List, I'm certainly very aware of a Holocaust connection. It wasn't something I felt so much. Yet, it really struck me just how much the difference in life could have been, would it have been a situation where the family had remained in Blashki. And I thought, what did somebody come to in Australia? They came to a place which is, for those who've been there, you know it's the best country in the world, physically, most beautiful country, best climate, whatever. Beyond that, though, there's the social structure and the social system. He arrived in Australia from England to British colonies at a time when Jews in Britain could not vote, where there were Jews and members of a number of the colony parliaments. He arrived in a place where he wanted to educate his children Jewishly. There was an order in the education department, children had to be educated in the religion of their parents. So Jewish parents had the same authority over their children as anybody else. It's not to say it was a country that was free of prejudice against anybody, but it was a British society or English society in the sense that the main documented prejudice was against, the clear outsiders in any Anglo-Saxon world, being the Irish. That's where the racism was. There was religious bigotry also against Catholics, who are now the largest religious group in Australia, but we're not. Jews were simply not relevant to any ongoing discussion about the nature of society and were seen as fully able to be Australian and Jewish. It simply was not an issue. More than that, some people put Jews together with money as a concept. There are two countries in the world where a Jew is on the highest denomination banknote in common currency, Israel and Australia. The man on the Australian $100 banknote is General Sir John Monash. John Monash was Prussian born. If he had been in the British Army rather than the Australian Army in the First World War, his chance of getting up there on talent were basically zero. He was a commander of an army, yet he was also the founding president of the Australian Zionist Federation. And Zionism was seen as a challenge to the British, certainly at the time he was involved. He could have been a relative of mine, but he dated my great-grandfather's sister and wrote in his diary she was too religious for him. But I can still use his story and it's almost a relative. But it shows in Australian society at that time, and certainly in my own family, no issue being completely Jewish and completely part of the Australian society. It's not to say there hasn't been prejudice of different sorts, but there's never been state-enforced prejudice, and Jews have never been the main target of anybody or anything. Now, the recent experience, and to understand where we are today, I think in Australia you need to know some of that background. Post-World War II, large-scale immigration from Europe. Now, included in that immigration were hundreds of thousands of people who were not ideological in any sense, were not exceptional in any sense, they wanted a better life, they came to Australia. If they were of European, British stock, that was the first group people wanted. When we realised they were no good at sport, we went for other people and started taking people from Lithuania, Ukraine. As long as you looked like Aryan stock, that was good, because it was a fear of the possible Asian invasion. But as well as these unideological, unacceptable people, there was also a quota of Jews, there were refugees, and there were fugitives, which included Nazi war criminals who came to Australia. And they came to Australia at a time when there was a very strong ethos of building one nation, of nation building, and working out policies to help people who came from overseas integrate into the Australian community. And one of the things that happened during the decades after the war was we had a government which believed in a policy called multiculturalism as a positive policy, which meant helping people arrive, integrate into a greater society. So what it meant is we had radio programs funded by the government in hundreds, or in tens of languages, but over 100 languages probably. We had groups that set themselves up as ethnic groups within Australian society who received government funding to provide services to people who did not speak the language or came from a different culture or a different country. We had groups called the Ethnic Community Council, which I used to go to. It was actually funny. I used to go to them representing the Yiddish speakers. I speak less Yiddish than I speak Polish. In Polish I know 6 words for complaints and illnesses I heard from my wife's grandmother. But I don't know Polish and I don't know Yiddish. But the Yiddish has said this is a matter of public affairs concern for the Jewish community. And as I was secretary of the Jewish Languages program on radio, where I was able to use my Tanakh ability to try and understand what the Ivrit speakers were saying, and my Yiddish, so I went along to these Ethnic Communities Council where I encountered what, I don't know how international it is, but I thought it's reasonably international. Mr. Hines had 57 varieties, it used to say on his soup cans, or his vegetable cans. Well, there were 57 varieties of anti-Semitism at least at these meetings. It seemed that the only thing a lot of the different ethnic groups had in common is they didn't like Jews very much. But they were all coming together. But I actually had a good time, because I used to go to the meetings and one would say, this one's a communist, that's one a communist. I sat with a group accidentally of Hungarian fascists. They were lovely people to have a coffee with. And the Ukrainians were also quite pleasant until I read their literature and translation. We had these lovely meetings where we would talk together about building a better Australian society, and you wonder why I didn't want this recording broadcast. And then we spoke together and we had very good relationships about furthering the possibility of a new arrival into Australia being fully part of Australian society. And one thing very important to understand in Australia now, with 26% of people who live in Australia born overseas, and another 20% having one or more parents born overseas, it's very important for the survival of Australia as a country to not discriminate or distinguish between those who became citizens through birth and those who became citizens through acquiring citizenship. And one of the things which sometimes freaks out people when I'm at human rights conferences internationally is Australia is a country where you can arrive as a refugee and in not too many years become a citizen. We don't see refugees as people to be looked after and moved on or repatriated. And I know the Canadian experience is similar, but there are not that many places where there are relatively large numbers over the decades of people who actually came and became fully part of the society. The issue we had here, of course, came with the Nazi war criminals, where we wanted them stripped of citizenship and deported. And we had some of the best friends of the Jewish community, people who genuinely cared about the nature of Australian society, said we can't touch the idea that once you're a citizen, you're a citizen. We can't take it away unless you could prove you gave over false pretenses. And there were no false pretenses to becoming Australian if you were a Nazi war criminal in most circumstances, because all you did was answer the questions you were asked by the Nazi collaborator who was working for the immigration department, who chose which questions to ask each applicant to guarantee their better chance of coming to Australia. So, in recent years, in addition to the European migrants, we've had numbers from all around the world, including, over the last 35 years, much larger number of Arabs, which include Christian Arabs as well as Muslim Arabs and others, Muslims from many countries, people who come from countries where Jews are high on the agenda or not there at all, and they've all come into the cultural mix in Australia as Australia tries to develop. And I mentioned the old varieties of anti-Semitism, and like this, somebody holds up a sign that says 5 minutes, that's clearly I don't know, is that old or new anti-Semitism? I'm 3/4 of the way through, so that should be fine. More than 3/4 of the way through. The most vocal recent examples of anti-Semitism in Australian society have come from Muslim groups. There was a fellow, Sheikh Halayli, who gave a speech at Sydney University, which is the institution I went to, the only real university in Australia. At Sydney University, I would say not for the benefit of those who believe there are other universities, could be many, but at Sheikh Halili, or said at this particular event, Jews were the cause of all wars. Now, he was somebody who could have been deported, but managed to use the fact that his children were Australian born to avoid deportation. And when he made his speech, it was a time before Australia had racial hatred wars. There are others who've made comments throughout the years. We have every group from around the world, and we all know many of them can make anti-Semitic comments. I had a recent example where I was at the Multicultural Eid Festival and Fair, which is the largest Muslim gathering in the Southern Hemisphere. I go every year, I wear my kippah, I speak, we have a really nice time. And this time I was wandering around and went to one of the bookshops and saw The International Jew by Henry Ford, which is clearly a very important Islamic text, or it would have been the religious text in the Islamic bookstore. And at the moment I'm working with the organisers of that festival, so it's the Muslims versus the rat bags, not the Jews versus the Muslims, in sort of the dynamic of working out what we do. But we know we have groups like that when they're around. We know the old anti-Semitism is still around. We had recently had an issue of a Hungarian Nazi war criminal and discussion about his deportation or extradition. And what we found there clearly is there were people who were talking about Jews using the pretext of this discussion to flash out any of their other concerns with Jews. We also know through studies over the years, Jewish behaviour has very little to do with anti-Semitism in Australia. Israeli behaviour, very little to do with anti-Semitism. Visibility of Jews is a big thing, like when there's times when Jews go to synagogue in large numbers, visibly around Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that is much more likely to be the time of incidents about Jews. A Jewish person winning a prize or doing something criminal, no difference. If they're in the media, it raises up some of the old anti-Semitism. And I know we all have, many of us are on Facebook, I presume most, we have Facebook friends. They pretend they care, they'll say happy birthday or whatever. But I have email friends, and they take a great deal of time and effort to write many words to tell me how bad Jews are. And I know they're around, and they write to me whenever there's an issue to do with Jews. And so we can say the old anti-Semites are still around. And one of the things that concerns all of us who are trying to deal with the future is on internet chat groups in Australia in many languages, we find a younger generation voicing just the same prejudices, maybe with some subtleties, but the same prejudices as their parents, grandparents, and older generations in language groups represented in the post-war fascist type communities, or people who were post-war fascists from various communities, as well as in Arabic and in people discussing Middle East politics. Now, what can we do about this? What do we try to do in Australia? Well, one of the things I do a lot of is interfaith dialogue, which does have its disadvantages. One of the disadvantages, during Ramadan, Muslims are fasting, but they now invite many guests to iftars to break the fast. So if you're not fasting, you go to 5 feasts in a week. It's not very good for the health, and somebody believe this is what does the lunatics call it? Stealth Islam. Yeah, this is stealth Islam. They try to kill us all by overfeeding us at their iftars and their multicultural festivals and their Eid festivals. But nevertheless, it can be very interesting. I had the experience for Tisha B'Av this year. I broke the fast of Tisha B'Av at the Nevi Ekram Mosque, which is a Shia mosque in Sydney. The chef there was educated in the holy city of Homs in Iran. He didn't know who the Jewish speaker was going to be at his multi-faith iftar. When I stood up to speak, only 2 left out of 500, but they didn't include the most prominent Shia figure in Australia. The other stayed, and we had a really good discussion about issues to do with Jews. We didn't talk about Israel because there'll hopefully be other occasions, but there was certainly a lot very helpful that came up. We also have, the government is doing a lot now. We have a very active multicultural advisory committee, and there's also something called the multicultural, the ambassadors of the people of Australia. There are 40 people appointed by the Prime Minister to say good things about Australia. I'm one of them, which is why I'm saying good things about Australia. But I think you got them because you already said good things about Australia. But I've chosen, it says end. I mean, some people don't know when things are ending. I thought it would be more than that. But I just want to say, in this, what was significant is I've chosen to be the speaker at the Muslim functions. So I turn up with my kippah representing the Prime Minister of Australia to let people know that Australia is a place where you can completely maintain your religious identity but be fully part of society. I would like to end with some quotes from a prominent Australian, Frank Lowy, who gave the multicultural speech, the first annual multiculturalism lecture this year. A Holocaust survivor fought in Israel's War of Independence and came to Australia and made a great life for himself. I won't, because this evil person says it's the end, and there's time for everybody else to discuss matters of concern, and I hope during the period of the next few days, as well as talking about anything that might have come up relevant to Australia, there's also the opportunity, if you wish, to discuss what goes on in such great friends of the Jewish community in my region, such as Malaysia.
As many of you know, in Israel we have many others. We have many others among Jews themselves, between Ashkenazis and Sephardis, between secular and ultra-Orthodox, between the Russian immigrants, the Ethiopian immigrants, and what have you. So when I speak about xenophobia or tolerating the other, I chose to speak about two minorities. One is an indigenous minority, the Arab citizens of Israel, and the other one is the new phenomena of African guest workers in Israel. So my talk today will be divided into two parts. First part, I'll speak about the minority-majority relationship between Arabs and Jews inside Israel. And in the second part, I'll speak about the African immigrants to Israel. Speaking about the Arabs in Israel, as you can see, on the image of my book, I would like to present to you the complexity of the problem. That the issue of Arabs and Jews in Israel is different from many other, or almost all other minority-majority relationships, because as you see in this image, Arabs and Jews are divided in the middle, but they also share a common eye. This was the commercial for my book. Now I'll start my lecture. Speaking about Israeli Arabs, we have today about 1.2 million Arabs who are citizens, Palestinian citizens of Israel, those who remained in Israel after 1948. I'm not speaking about the Palestinians of the West Bank, nor do I speak about the West or about East Jerusalem Palestinians, because they only have Israeli identity. They do not have Israeli citizenship. I mean, they have only Jerusalem residency rights. They cannot vote to the Knesset. They can only vote to the Jerusalem municipality, and most of them decide not to vote. So, as you see, the Arabs are residing in four main areas, one in the Galilee, the other one in the central part of Israel, what we call the Triangle, Wadi Ara, the third part, the Bedouins of the Negev, and the fourth, which is not a group, but they are split in the five mixed cities in Israel, Ramla, Yafo, Lod, Haifa, and Akko. The case of Arabs in Israel is very complex, as I said. Unlike many immigrant communities in Europe and elsewhere in the West world, Arabs are an indigenous minority. They had a sort of almost statehood before Jews returned to Zion. They were part, of course, of the Ottoman Empire, but they felt that they are, I would say, a special group inside this territory. But speaking about the phenomenon of Arabs, the Arabs are the only minority in the world that I know, if you know on another one, please correct me, that are a minority and a majority in the same time. They feel they are a minority in Israel, but they are a majority in the region. They are part of the 350 million Arabs in the region, or if you like, they are also part, because most of them are, 80% of them are Muslims, they are part of the Muslim world, which is 1.5 billion souls. So they feel at the same time not as a weak minority, but they feel themselves as a very strong minority inside Israel, and then you have their demands. Arabs and Jews both, because of this point, I would say suffer from what we call a siege mentality. They are a minority versus the other majority, but the Jews also are a minority in the region, which explains, in part, the relationship towards the Arab minority. The second issue is that the Arabs express their solidarity with an active enemies of Israel in times of war, with Hamas, with Hezbollah. Take as an example the Second Lebanon War, when from about 41 Israeli dead people in that war by rockets launched by Hezbollah, 18 were Arabs, but still among those who were hurt, the families expressed their solidarity with Hassan Nasrallah. So this is a different situation to what you have in every other place of minority-majority relation. And the third point of uniqueness of the Israeli case is that Israel defines itself as Jewish and democratic, but defines itself as Jewish and democratic, meaning that it gives reference in immigration laws, in the symbols of the state, in land policies and settlement, and as well as in religious institutions, to the one ethnos of the state, which is the Jews. So the problem is that if you look at the issue between Jews and Arabs in Israel, what we have here is, I would say, a salient case of interlocking conflict. For those of you who are familiar with political science theories, interlocking conflict is a conflict which is part of a series of conflicts in which you have same actors in this series of conflict or same theme issues in the conflict. The Israeli Jewish Arab minority-majority relation is part of the broader conflict in the Middle East. It's part of the broader Palestinian-Israeli encounters. It is part of the struggle between Israel and the Arab world, and if you like also you can add the Muslim world. Second important issue is that in Israel, Arabs and Jews view the history in a mirror image. There are parallel histories, parallel narratives, clashing narratives, if you like. Whatever Israel, and the main issues are the right to the land. The main issues of debate are the right to the land, who is entitled to the land. And the second issue is the responsibility for the 1948 war and its aftermath. I mean, aftermath meaning the Nakba, what Palestinians term as their Nakba. Arabs, unlike many other places where Arabs are immigrants, or where Muslims are immigrant minorities, Arabs are not, according to these analyses, are not a friendly minority because they express solidarity with the Palestinians, with those Palestinians who decided to struggle against Israel, to resist, if you like, to use the term that they use and we use for resistance the term terror. Jews have many fears. One prominent Israeli scholar, Amnon Rubinstein, once said that Jews in Israel are suffering from paranoia. We are a paranoid group because we suffer from the persecution before we came to Israel, then the Holocaust, then every 10 years on average we have a war, and we believe that the Arabs really want to throw us to the sea. So there is an ethnic tension between Jews and Arabs in Israel. It is not exactly a xenophobia. If I can coin a term, and I'm not sure if I'm the first to do it, I would say it's not exactly xenophobia. What we see here is power contestation between Jews and Arabs, and perhaps we have a phenomenon of what I will coin ethnophobia. I mean, two ethnic groups who fear each other. Now, some examples of So some examples of the problem that I explained before, I would like to emphasize the fact that the Arabs in Israel are torn between their national identity as Palestinians, as Arabs and Muslims, and as citizens of the state of Israel. The issue is very complicated here. One example, a prominent politician, the head of the Communist Party, Rakach Party, Hadash in Israel, emphasizes that they are inseparable part of the Palestinian people and that they are a national minority in the state that is hostile to them as well as it is hostile to the Palestinians. Another example of what we see as Palestinization, is the meeting of Arab leaders with Yasser Arafat at the time to express their solidarity in one of the issues between Israel and the Palestinians. This is another example. Arab minority in Israel rioted 2 times. Once, the first time was in the Land of the Day. This photo is taken from March of 1976. Tawfiq Zayad was the most charismatic leader among Arabs ever since. And he said, we are 500,000 people who can raise their 1 million hands against occupation. And the second riot took place in October of 2000 when an outbreak of the second Intifada, when Arabs decided to join actually the first violence of the Intifada, and Jewish-Arab clashes erupted. 13 Arabs found their death in the police attempt to disperse the demonstration. But this is not the complete picture. I want to be uneven and objective about the issue. There are discriminatory practices of Jews against Arabs in the policy, particularly the government policy. You cannot see, you cannot see it on the daily encounters between Jews and Arabs who meet in working places, in universities, educational institutions, and so on. You see it particularly in government policies. As an example, non-recognized villages. There are about 35, in the past there were more, 35 Bedouin villages, not exactly a village, what you have in mind, but people who live or reside in one place that the government wants to take hold of the land because the government does not recognize the right to the land. It is a very complicated debate about the right of ownership of the land of the Bedouins in the Negev. And the people have to live without, I would say, basic facilities. Recently, the High Court decided that they will benefit from national facilities of water, electricity, education, and so on. But until a few years ago, they didn't have all of these infrastructure facilities. And this is only one example of discriminatory practices of many, many fields, far beyond of what is meaning to be a Jewish state. So, just to make the picture more complicated, I would say that on the other hand, the Arabs benefit from many advantages in Israel, particularly in the realm of cultural rights. Arabic language is the second official language in Israel. If you take like Kurdish language in Turkey or in Syria, recently it was not allowed to use the language or to educate in the language. There is a special educational system in the Arabic language. The Arabs they have their own educational system, of course, in the framework of the national Israeli education, but it is they can enroll in in Arab predominantly schools in their own locality. Thank you, 5 minutes, so I have to turn to the other subject. They are represented in the Knesset, and if we speak about coexistence, there are many manifestations of coexistence between Jews and Arabs. There is a process of Israelization alongside the process of Palestinization. Arabs are integrated in the civil service. They encounter Jews in many NGOs. There are many joint NGOs of Jews and Arabs, and so on. And just to speak about this issue. Okay, thank you. It is. Okay. So, manifestations of coexistence, as I say, are many. They are very. Recently, I conducted a poll, a public opinion survey among 500 Arabs and 500 Jews about the relationship between each other on a concept that I developed in the Jerusalem Institute for Israel Studies called inclusive citizenship, an Israeli inclusive citizenship. And what I found was really impressive in terms of how many Jews and Arabs would see themselves as living together, separately but living together, and in a coexistence situation. 80% of the Arabs, mind you, agree that Israel will remain defined as Jewish and democratic state. I would say on the condition that it will not discriminate them on the day-to-day basis. And that right of return of Jews will be, the law of return of Jews will be implemented as it is today. And they will serve in the civil service, in a special civilian service, what in Germany is called Zivildienst, as a substitute to the army service, and provided that Israel will grant them equal rights in the civil realm. Jews, I was also surprised to find most of the Jews are willing to give their Arabs equal rights in the civilian realm. Civilian, I mean in the civil, in budget allocation of infrastructures, the economy, the educational service, and so on. And but the Jews are still hesitant about entitling the Arabs with collective rights like recognizing the national leadership of the Arabs, or recognizing that the Arabs will have a special independent department in the Ministry of Education. Anyway, what other surveys found that both, if you look at, this is a survey conducted a few years ago by a scholar named Pikinski in America, showing that most of the Arabs, 90% as you can see, support coexistence inside Israel, and also most of the Jews, but Arabs as a minority seek to be more integrated, so they are the ones who want to do want to be integrated into the state. In conclusion, I would say that if we see manifestations of discrimination, if we see manifestations of, I would say, hostile discourses between Jews and Arabs, they are not exactly xenophobia. It is more on a group-based fear of each other, what I termed before as ethnophobia. The conflict between the minority and majority in Israel is I would say, a manifestation of interlocking conflict, part of a broader, protracted conflict that Israel is undergoing together with its neighbors. And there is a duality between, I would say, national struggle within Israel and living together in coexistence on the other hand. If you like to know how can we deal with this issue, please do not hesitate to ask questions afterwards. Thank you.